this is Kate Hula, and this is my case study for AEP 855 for Module 9. The first thing we need to do is summarize the case. So we have some people involved are Richard Inman, who is a first-year assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. We also have James, who is a Southside student who is known to have a lot of behavioral issues. And this is someone that Richard has been trying to build a relationship with, as well as the other Southside students, because he himself was a Southside student. And because of this relationship building, James's grades have improved, and he hasn't been involved in as many fights. We also have David Ramos, who is a younger student who is an honor student and could be considered a model student because he hasn't had any behavioral concerns to this point. And then we also have a police officer involved. So what happened? Richard asked James to come to his office to talk about some tardy concerns because he was tardy for the past 3 days. On his way to the office, James gives David something, and another teacher sees this. David starts acting nervous after this exchange happens, so the teacher calls James back and is afraid that it's drug-related, so she tells Richard what she saw and what her concerns are. So Richard decides to go ahead and have James and David escorted down to his office by the police officer and have the police officer stay in the room with them as he investigates. While he is investigating, they find David in possession of brass knuckles. So this leads to the officer handcuffing David because he has possession of a prohibited weapon. Which leads David to being very upset and distraught. James sees this and goes ahead and admits that he bullied or forced David into taking the brass knuckles, which then led to both boys being arrested for possession of a prohibited weapon, and then they both are supposed to be expelled according to the school's zero tolerance policy. So this happened on an early spring morning at Rocket Junior High. So who is involved and concerned in this situation? Richard is involved, and he's very proud of James that he confessed to forcing David into taking the brass knuckles, but he still doesn't understand why David had to be arrested and should be expelled when it was admitted to them that he had nothing to do with it, and he was basically just forced into taking the brass knuckles. Because of this, and he knows that it would damage David's future, so he decides not to write the paperwork to expel David. We have James, who's involved, and he is arrested and expelled, and then we have David, of course, who's arrested for the felony, but isn't expelled into the program because Richard knows that it can be damaging to his future. We have David's mom, who is upset that her son was arrested and will be possibly expelled when she and the other people know that he was just bullied into the action. And we have the director of secondary education, who told Richard to follow through with the school policy and go ahead and do the expulsion papers. So next we need to report any legal or ethical issues. Has anyone been harmed by the action or decision of another? Yes, we have David, who was harmed by James into bullying him, into taking the brass knuckles into his possession. We also have him harmed by Richard because Richard decided to have the police officer stay in the room while he investigated, while the officer could have just stayed outside of the room. This could have possibly allowed Richard to explain the situation to the police officer and just lead to James having the consequences instead of both boys. But since the police officer stayed in the room, both boys had the consequences. Richard was also harmed by James's decision because now he's put in an ethical dilemma where he could get an official reprimand on his personnel file or not do the expulsion papers and harm a young student's future. So does this action go against an existing law? Yes, it does. Each student was in possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. And was there a breach of contract? Yes. Richard went against the school's policy and decided not to file the paperwork to expel David for at least 45 days into the district's Disciplinary Alternative Education Program, or the DAEP. Next, we need to synthesize exactly what happened in a single sentence. So I wrote that Richard Inman is faced with an ethical dilemma of following school policy and expelling a young honor student who was bullied into possessing a prohibited weapon on school property and not expel him because he was the first offense and it could negatively impact his future. After that, we need to synthesize the facts. So a prohibited weapon was found in David's possession in Richard's office. James admitted to forcing David into taking the weapon when he was originally called into the office for a tardiness concern. Both boys were arrested and charged with a felony for possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. The school policy states that there is a zero tolerance and that both boys need to be expelled for at least 45 days into the AEP. David's mother is upset with Richard in the school because she believes that David shouldn't have any consequences since he was bullied into the situation. Because of this, and because of his own morals, Richard decides not to file the paperwork on David to expel him because he knows it could negatively impact his future, and he has no history of violence at this point, but he goes ahead and expels James. So David comes back to school 1 week later, while James is still at the AEP. Richard then gets a call from the director of secondary education telling him to file the expulsion paperwork on David. Richard explains the situation to the director, hoping to persuade him otherwise, but the director understands this situation and how difficult it is, but still tells him that he needs to follow school policy or he'll be forced to write an official reprimand that would stay on Richard's personnel file. After that, we need to review and prioritize the information. So the decision could be damaging to the stakeholders and have a negative impact on them. And the stakeholders in this situation are Richard, David, David's mom, the director of secondary education, and then James and his parents. I can learn more about this situation. I would like to know if Richard talked about this ethical dilemma with his principal, maybe for guidance since he is an assistant and it is his first year, before he decided to go ahead and not file the paperwork. I'd also like to know how James and his family would react if Richard doesn't expel David. Would they be understanding or would they be very upset by this and cause more of a problem at school? And then could there be or is there a school committee that could communicate about this dilemma and then make an ethical and legal decision that would maybe be better for everyone involved, where everybody would be happy? After we do that, I need to identify your options and possible consequences. So the first option would be to make no decision, have no action. This would mean that the expulsion paperwork isn't filed. An official reprimand would be written and put into the assistant principal's personnel file, and that the paperwork could be filed by somebody else, whether the director himself or the principal, which would then mean that David is still expelled. Option 2 would be file the paperwork. So this would make David's mom upset because she doesn't like how the school handled the ethical decision, and it can ruin the relationship with David and his mom with the school. And of course, David's reputation is hurt or ruined, even though he hasn't had any behavioral issues or concerns until this incident. Option 3 would be find another consequence instead of expulsion, since it is his first offense. However, a consequence of this could be that you would still receive an official reprimand because you still didn't follow school policy. And option 4 would be having the stakeholders come to a decision together with the principal and a few other impartial staff or administration members. This could allow the people involved to decide to follow the school's policy, however, and expel David. Finally, I need to evaluate my options. So option 1, the pros of not taking any action would be that David's mom is happy with how the ethical decision was handled, and David's reputation isn't ruined for his first offense. The cons would be that relationships with James in the South Side could be damaged because he received full consequences while David did not. Also, a con could be that it could interfere with cultivating ethical behavior in other students and staff because they saw that the assistant principal didn't follow school policy. It would be hard for them to see why they need to follow school policy as well. And then the official reprimand on his personnel file. Option 2, the pros of filing the paperwork would be that you're able to model and cultivate ethical behavior because you did follow school policy and you don't receive an official reprimand. The cons, however, would be that David's reputation is ruined. It damages the relationship with David and his mom, with the school and the assistant principal, and it goes against what you think is ethically right since it is his first offense and he was bullied into the situation. For option 3, for finding another consequence, the pros would be that David still has a consequence for his actions, but it won't damage his reputation, and you can model ethical behavior. However, the cons would be that you could still receive a reprimand because you would went against school protocol still. You still went against this policy, and James and other students or parents could see it used as special treatment. Option 4 would then be having stakeholders come together to make a decision, involving also the principal and other impartial staff. The pros of this would be that you as a group are able to evaluate, communicate about, and advocate for the desired ethical decision, so you can kind of persuade and try to push the decision not to expel the student. Everyone gets to voice their opinion and be part of the decision, and it allows for adjustments to the school policy that is probably needed in situations like this. So the cons, though, would be that most likely someone would be upset with the decision made. So now I need to choose the best option. With all the options, I would choose option 4 because I would want to be able to have everyone come together and communicate about and evaluate about what would be the best ethical and lawful decision. Everyone would be able to voice their opinions at one time with the administration in the same room, so there would be less chance of communication error back and forth. It would also allow for the possibility of changing the school's zero tolerance policy for situations like David's dilemma, where they haven't had any priors and they were forced into making that decision. It could also allow the team to make a different consequence for David, so he would still have some consequence for his actions, but he'll also keep the respect and relationships built between the two families involved and other families at the school. This would be the best way for the school to model and cultivate ethical behavior in others while they promote the future success and well-being of each student as well. So imagine implementing your decision. So this is the final thing I need to do. So I need to choose my path. So the first thing I would do is talk to the principal and the two families involved, the director of secondary education, and other impartial staff, including the principal themselves and myself, and come together to evaluate the situation to make an ethical, lawful decision. So I would talk about this idea with my principal. After that, I would invite all of those people I just mentioned to a meeting, make a date, and invite them to it. And then I would develop some rules and guidelines, probably with my principal, to allow everyone to voice their opinions and their concerns. The fourth thing I would do is have a voting process with pen and paper so it's impartial, so people aren't pressured to change their vote, basically, by having people raise their hands. And then lastly, I would explain that the decision made is the final decision before I share the results. So this way people aren't upset and everyone understands what the rules are and that this is what the decision is going to be. If this plan of action doesn't work, I would choose a different consequence from David, so option 3. I don't think it's ethically and morally right for him to not have any consequences at school for his actions, but I do think that expulsion I don't think that expulsion is needed for the first offense, especially since he was bullied into the action. Thank you.